So what's this lifting state up concept all about? Well, at the moment, in our application, we have the problem that we have the start screen, which welcomes the user and provides this start quiz button. But we then also have the questions screen to which we want to navigate when that button is pressed. So the problem that we have here is that the button that should trigger the state change is in one widget, and the widget that should be affected by the state change is another widget. So we have kind of two widgets that need to work with the same state or that depend on the same state. And the solution here is to lift the state up, which is why we already created that quiz widget. If we manage our state in that quiz widget, and we then also have the function for manipulating the state in there, we can conveniently move between these two different widgets by rendering content conditionally. And that's of course what we're already doing here. We do already manage and update some state in this quiz widget in the end, in the state class that is connected to this quiz widget. And we are rendering the content conditionally already. So we basically already lifted the state up, but we haven't connected this switch screen function to the screen that contains the button that should trigger this function or this method here. And that is another important and therefore at the moment missing aspect of this lifting the state up concept. It's not enough to just manage the state in some shared parent widget, which quiz here is. It's the parent widget of both start screen and questions screen, but it's not enough to just manage the state here, but instead you also must make sure that the child widget that should initiate the state change, in this case the start screen widget, gets access to the state changing function defined in this parent widget. So in this case, start screen needs to get access to this switch screen function. And how do we now do that? Well, you might remember that in the previous course section, I did explain that functions in Dart are also just regular values. There we also had a button that should trigger some function, and in that case back then it was a function, a method defined in the same file, but still it was a method that should be triggered when a button was pressed. And to do that, we passed a pointer at that function. So we used the function name in the end as a value to that button, and internally that button would then call that function when the button was pressed. And we can do the same here with our own custom widget. We can pass a pointer at switch screen to start screen. So simply by using the name of that method, switch screen, like this. So you don't add parentheses here, because that would execute this function when this line of code here is executed, and that would be too early. Instead, you just use the name of the function or method here, and that in the end, under the hood, passes a pointer to that function as a value to start screen. And inside of that start screen widget, you can then use that function to call it whenever you want. For example, when some timer expired or when this button down there was pressed. Now at the moment, this doesn't work because we're basically passing in too many arguments to start screen, because I'm passing in one argument here, the pointer at the switch screen function, but start screen at the moment doesn't want any positional arguments. It just has this one named argument here. Now that can be changed though. We can add a positional argument to start screen, and we could also add a named argument, but here I'll go for a positional argument. And this argument could be called start quiz. The name is totally up to you. But now we're accepting this positional argument, and we should also define the type of this argument by adding it in front of the argument name. And here the type is function, which is a special type built into Dart. To be precise, it's a void function, and you should now also add parentheses here, which simply means that start quiz should be a function, and function is a type built into Dart. So it should be a function that takes no arguments, because indeed switch screen does not take any arguments. So as a value for start quiz, we want to get a pointer at a function that takes no arguments and that also doesn't return a value. And that's exactly what switch screen does. It is a function that takes no arguments and returns nothing. And with that, we're passing a pointer at this function as a value to start screen. So now we can call this function from inside start screen by simply executing start quiz like a function, because it is a function basically. Start quiz is an argument that contains a function as a value. That's what we set up here. And I'm spending a lot of time on this because this can be a super confusing concept, but in the end, it's all about a standard Dart feature. You are able to use functions as values and therefore to also pass them as values to other functions or to constructor functions, as we're doing it here. But with that alone, we're not done. We're accepting this argument here, but as you also learned in the previous course section, this alone is not enough, because the arguments you accept here in your constructor function can, for example, not be used in your build method. So we can't use it down there where we would want to use it, because that's where our button is to which this function should be connected in the end. What we should therefore do is we should add a new variable, or even better, a final variable here to start screen, because we'll only set this once when the start screen widget is created. And this final variable will be of this type, so we can cut this type. And here we could name this start quiz as well. And now with that name being equal to that name, we can use that shortcut built into Dart where we add this dot in front of start quiz to automatically set the value we get here for this argument as a value for this variable here. So in the end, when this widget class is created, when the object is instantiated, this start quiz variable is set to the value we receive on this start quiz argument. And with that, we now have this variable, this start quiz variable, which can now be used anywhere in this class, including this build method. So now down here, for onPressed on this outlined button, we can use start quiz and execute it like a function in this anonymous function. And by the way, here we're doing the same thing as we did here in the quiz state class. Here in quiz state, we're passing a pointer at switch screen as a value to start screen. In the start screen widget, we're passing this anonymous function, a pointer at this anonymous function, therefore, as a value to onPressed. That's the same pattern in the end. And in this anonymous function body, we're executing our own start quiz function, but this anonymous function body will only be executed when the button is pressed, because the anonymous function is passed as a value to the onPressed argument, and that argument is used internally inside of that button to then execute this function whenever the button is tapped. And therefore this code in this function body also only executes when the button is tapped. Alternatively, we could also replace this anonymous function with a pointer at start quiz. So this start quiz variable, which we added here. Keep in mind that in that variable, we store a function. And therefore, of course, we can use this variable as a value for onPressed, because onPressed wants a function. Start quiz contains such a function, and therefore start quiz can be used here because it's then the value stored in this start quiz variable that will be used as a value for onPressed. And that is that function that should then be executed when the button is pressed. And ultimately, it's this switch screen function, of course, because that's the function we're passing around. And with that, we in general have the setup we need to manage the state in that widget, that quiz widget, that is in the end a parent widget of both start screen and question screen, because both these widgets are used inside of the quiz widget. But at the moment I'm getting an error